Good evening, everyone. It's Glenn. Today, I want to talk about some ideas surrounding what I think is the location of Neverland, in a manner of speaking, and the source of the Holy Roman Empire, the actual Roman Empire when we think of today. So, to give you some background, we have here's an image of Peter Pan, and I'm putting together a lot of ideas that obviously will not make sense. It's just a lot of ideas that seem to point in the same direction. Peter Pan is, of course, a famous story about a boy that entices children to go on an adventure to some paradise of lost boys, and it's to do with a captain and red Indians and things like that. The actual concept of uh, the actual concept of Peter Pan is similar to the Pan myth, and scholars have already identified that there's a lot of correlations between the original Greek Pan myth and Peter Pan. You've got to remember that when you have myths, there's myths and there's myths. In the sense is that if you're thinking about Europe, you really need to focus on Gaelic myths and rather than say Celtic. Now, the difference being is that I think one lends itself to a Scythian origin, and another one is more indigenous. I'll have to do that in another video. It's a lot of ideas around that. Anyway, Pan is Pan, and Peter Pan comes from that. The interesting name about Peter Pan, I'll get to later. Now, the author is J.M. Barrie. I think he's Scottish. He has an interesting life. He was apparently had a very dark nature and an unhealthy attraction to children, perhaps, and he ended up becoming a baronet. He was given the order of a baronet later in life, and the order of merit. And these sort of things are very strange. I mean, for writing a few books, being involved with a few inner circle people to do some literary work, and to create a piece of work that seems to capture a massive amount of archetypes and natural story going through several genres. Now, um, so Peter Pan is an iconic story. Its origins, just going back again, is more to do with Peter being someone that is a pan, is halfway between nature, lives in the forest, uses the flute to attract children, just like the story of the piper who takes the mice away out of the village, and the mice or the rats could mean anything. So it's about someone who uses techniques and tricks to draw people out of something. So that's the big part. There's a lot of issues, a lot of references to children being taken from their homes and taken away from their families. And then within the Peter Pan narrative, you have pirates, you have red Indians. I'll get to that a bit later, perhaps, or another video. All right. So what drew me to this is that I some time ago, I was researching the origin of the Romanov dynasty, and perhaps how you would, I mean, all of us do this when we're doing alternative research. We say, well, where do all these dynasties come from? What is the dynasty? And you keep going back to Romanov a lot because obviously there's a name Romanov, and that sort of tweaks your interest. And of course, they reference the Rurik dynasty, which apparently is the original dynasty. And when I went back to that and started looking at that and started looking at the history of the king, it led me to a very interesting origin where the original king is associated with a place called Staraya Ladoga, which is located here. You should be able to see it here. This is part of Russia, and this is the Gulf of Finland, and then it goes through St. Petersburg, and it's located in the middle there. Staraya Ladoga has an interesting history. What is very strange, of all the things, instead of archaeology, they use something called dendrochronology, which is a study of tree rings to determine the date of something. They have placed the age of Ladoga to 753 AD, which is an interesting suggestion based on tree rings. They could have used anything, and they've decided to record that of all things. Now, the importance of 753 AD is, if you're into alternative chronology, it obviously correlates to 753 BC, which is the apparent founding of the Roman Empire, which people now purport was not completely true. We don't have much evidence of the original Rome, of course. So just stop it there for a sec and let's go back to, is there a Rome or is there not a Rome? Okay, so when you are thinking about Rome, we all think of Rome from the foundation to the Republic to the Empire, and then it breaks up and that sort of thing. We don't actually know anything much about it. There's not many written records. All you know is that there was an ancient Greece, which could, for all intents and purposes, been more like ancient Byzantium or Romani Paxos or something. Anyway, at some point or other, we're told that the Gallic Empire only lasted for like 14 years. This is the Gallic Empire. If you look at the map here, the Gallic Empire is green. It clearly includes England. That should be considered significant. You have all this Romani Empire, and you have the Palmyra Empire here. Now, when you get down further into it and you try and understand what is Rome to begin with, you end up getting confused about the concepts to do with Roman coins. Roman coinage will pretty much tell you that you don't know anything about Rome, because you end up having all these bearded people, all sorts of features, some of which are Illyrian people, Galatian people of various power structures. It's important to know that because the coinage will determine the power structure. So the more coins you research and the more you look at where they're minted, what they're minted, who minted them, what's the name, what's the actual name on the coins, you actually start figuring out the power structure, because only the top can put their face on the top coin. Think about that when you're thinking about, was there an actual Rome? Well, there was, but it's more fragmented. To give you another insight into whether there was a Rome or not, you need to think about some of the more famous apparent Roman Caesars. Okay, so for example, Nero, who lived until 54 AD, I think. I'm not sure. I think it is. But if the basic principles is that you got to look at his name. You got to look at how much coinage had his face on it throughout Gaul. Possibly not much. His name is as well is Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, or sometimes, that was it. So what that tells me, just based on the amount of archaeological evidence, is that he really was a Germanic. He was a Germanic Caesar, which could be just as easily pronounced Khazar. He was a Germanic Khazar. Augustus is, because he's great. Tiberius, because he probably owned the port of Tiber in Italy. He apparently had power in London, based on the archaeological evidence. To be honest, I don't think he had any power throughout Europe. It's quite bizarre to think that he had no power in Gaul. He might have had some. He probably didn't have any kingship at all in Western. It's quite a possibility. Something worth investigating. It gives you an idea that ancient Rome probably ain't Rome. What is Rome that we think of was probably a superimposed Holy Roman Empire dragged down by a Germanic people into Europe, most likely sponsored by other vested interests, which could be the Papal States, it could be the Kievan Rus, there could have been various other stakeholders that were creating this monster that had to consume the powers that are already there to replace older oligarchs with newer oligarchs. And then they basically superimposed themselves onto the original Roman Empire. So, Julius Caesar became real, even though he might not have been that powerful back in the day. So they basically took over Europe and then rewrote the history books. But where did this Holy Roman Empire come from? So I go back again to some of the names in the early power structures of the Vikings and so on. So if you go back to Starale Ladoga here, this is where it's located. This is the general area. Okay. Right. So that's the Baltic Sea. The King of Denmark had a lot of power, and the Vikings, the King of Denmark and the Vikings are the same thing. Then they're basically a bunch of hired pirates that create havoc, and then the king went and cleaned up the mess. And then you've got, if you go back into this part, why Starale and Ladoga? Because it is referenced. The name is unusual, and it's next to St. Petersburg. And of all things, St. Petersburg is on what's called the Never River. Never River means new, or it means it could mean a few things in whichever language. It could pertain to up to the ocean, whatever. Anyway, so if you look at St. Petersburg, and anyone who studies source of Christianity, you'll start to see that Christianity was found it was invented by the original Roman powers, whoever they were, but they were actually the Julian Claudia dynasties, and particularly the Flavian dynasties, and they may have well been Scythian come. They could have been pseudo-Celtic powers when I think about it. I'm just thinking out loud here. But there's a lot of academic evidence that the Romans invented Christianity in 70 AD, but which Romans? The one in the south, or the burgeoning Germanic dynasties that were trying to graft themselves onto the southern powers? I think it was that. Anyway, St. Petersburg means St. Peter. Peter means rock, stone, foundation. If you look at strategically from why this is important, okay, Starale Ladoga is located here. Sorry, there's a huge river system which is the start of what's called the Volga trade routes. Obviously, if you are a bunch of Viking raiders that are trying to control the world from the top, you're in a great place because no one can get through this Denmark structure. You'll never be able to invade that. And once you're through here, you'll never be able to get through all the way through to past the St. Peter's Channel, and you'll never be able to take on the various power structures. So basically, once the ships pass through here, they're basically unstoppable and untraceable. Now, why is that important? Okay, so first of all, I wanted to go back to Starale Ladoga, which is apparently 753 AD. The etymology of Starale Ladoga makes no sense. If you look at the etymology, it says a bunch of stuff that probably doesn't make it doesn't mean anything. But just looking at the words itself, Staraya could mean, well, if you break it up, Star Raya, a star in Russian is 100. Raya, well, go for it. It could be rays of the sun, or Staraya just means a star, or the way of the star, or something. Ladoga is quite straightforward. Ladoga, so that's the dog star. Why is that important? Why is the dog star important? Okay, this is one of the keys. You have the dog star, you have Danish kings, you have Peter Pan, you have the history of the Holy Roman Empire possibly coming from here. Okay, so if you think about it this way, Holy Roman Empire is 800 AD-ish onwards. Starale Ladoga is founded 753, and the Ruriks are starting to get to power in the 800s, exactly the same time as the Vikings are getting to power. The Vikings are linked to the King of Denmark. You can even find that out all for yourself anytime. Okay, so there's multiple trade routes that determine the power structure in the 8th and 9th century. This is just from Wikipedia. This is called the Volga trade route. This is the main trade route, and Starale Ladoga is going to be here. That's going to be your main hub. It's basically impenetrable. No one could get through that. There was river systems all through here that basically means that they could do anything they wanted. And they could access anywhere, even though it's way up north. They had a lot of control just from that position. Okay? Think about that. In comparison, the main southern power structures of the period was called the Radhanite trade route, which is more extensive. The Radhanites were thought to be based somewhere in Mesopotamia because they were Jewish, but I think that they were more around West Switzerland, southern France, where the Rhine River is, and there's a place called Sion. I'd imagine that's it. The Radhanites were incredibly powerful and probably the most intense trading routes all through the world. And you're talking here, this is verified by scholars, Islamic scholars. They basically had the whole world in their hands, literally the whole thing, except perhaps the Americas, and that's to be thought about. So you've got different power structures that you need to think about. You had the Radhanites essentially controlling more the mid part of the world, probably African Mali type empire doing the south, and various other powers we could talk about. And then at the very north, you would have had the Volga trade route, and the Volga trade route would have been controlled by the king of by the Rurik dynasty. And then as time goes on, and they become the umpire, so to speak. They're the ones that control everything. It's always a ruse, and you'll see in various things, if you go back to the definition of it, you have an image here of the Rus trading slaves of the Khazars in East Slavic camps. Okay, so here we are being depicted with Rus and the Khazars, and if you can see here quite clearly, you have different powers trading slaves. Now, slave trade is the essence of everything. It's slave trade that defines the long-term migration and DNA mix of people, and it also tells you ultimately the subversiveness of our origins. And if you've got now a evidence of obviously slave trade mixed with powers that we know today, where you can go to things like the King Canute, who is a Danish-English king who got England by all the Viking raids and had all this power, and the various Danish kings made an enormous amount of shipbuilding, creating enormous power, and most likely retained power indefinitely. The flag of Denmark is, of course, a red flag with a white cross, and Switzerland being the ultimate power hub as a white flag with a red cross, and of course the Vatican have Swiss Guard. So there you are. I mean, the whole thing's related in one fancy straight line, and it all ties back to Rurik, and these guys seem to tie back to Starala Ladoga, which means dog star. What does that mean? Well, I'm glad you asked. Dog star is Sirius, and any of you who do this megalithic stuff go, oh yes, the Sirius this and the dog star, yes. It's in the Canis constellation, it is the dog star, it is Sirius, it's amazing, but it's basically part of the southern hemisphere. And what does that mean? Does it mean anything that's in the southern hemisphere? Well, it's not that far south, and there is it can be seen at plus 60 degrees latitude or minus 90 latitude. So it can be seen from the South Pole up to plus 60 degrees, okay? You have huge amounts of references to dog throughout all of this history of these dark slave-related cultures, the Canaanites, the Canute could also be referenced to Cain, Cain himself, Cain this, Cain that, dogs of war, the way dogs are associated with pirates and pups and pirates, and And even infantry comes. There's infants which from all the slave trade and the brothels, and then they have spare children. And they just become infantry basically. They just become soldiers and sailors and seamen. It's all sorts of all that rhetoric, and you can see where it all goes to. So, how does this all tie together? Well, what's interesting about, particularly about Starella Ladoga, it doesn't face Cirrus B. I mean, it might if I did more analysis, and maybe it does somehow, and maybe that's something you could do. But it is located. Um, it is located 60 degrees north and 32 east. Okay, so what would have happened in Strela Ladoga, looking over the plain, is that you would have seen the dog star Sirius right on the horizon. So you couldn't have seen it any further north. So I think that's as any further north, you no longer can see the dog star, and hence that's as far as you could have gone. And I think that's an obvious relationship between all of those things. So um, so you've got 753 AD. You've got some amazing history. You've got strategic human slave trade. You've got the Volga slave trade starting here. You have the Romanovs. You have strange power structures going through the world, basically culminating in some author coming out of the blue who's known to be a bit of a weirdo, this guy. A lot of strange stuff with him, and he becomes it in 5 minutes flat a baronet, which is bestowed upon him by a king, and these titles are rare, so he could be from a much older lineage being recycled through. And you've got to remember that when you're thinking about Romanovs and you're thinking about the current powers of England and Great Britain, they were related, they are connected. And you can start to go through the genealogies and understand that there's matrilineal and patrilineal heritage that you need to reconcile. It takes a lot of work, but essentially it looks like to me that Peter Pan is a creation or a bringing together of archetypal myths to do with stealing children and human slave trade, which goes into the Never River, which is Neverland, or it matches. It doesn't mean he was directly connecting the two, but from a power structure point of view, it looks like that Starala Ladoga is your starting point, or your Heimat, I think it's called, of the Roman Empire. That's quite a strong potential. Okay, thanks for that. I'll hopefully you can do your own research, come up with different ways to tie the dots together. And if I've got some nice images of Starella Ladoga, there you go. Beautiful, isn't it? Yeah. It's a classic one, actually. And it's just a beautiful place.